Welcome back to the Life Academy and this Pastor's Roundtable discussion of Jihad and the Jews. I'm Doug Pratt, and with me is Stephen Grant. Let's first review the sources of radical Islam and its current form, violent jihad or holy war of terror, directed specifically at the nation of Israel, but also broadly at the United States and Europe with their predominantly Christian heritage. Modern scholars and historians trace the radical Islamism of the later 20th and early 21st century, which has frequently employed terror as one of its primary tactics and has been expressed in iterations known as the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, ISIS or Islamic State, Taliban, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., to both political, cultural issues, that is, the economic, military, and cultural dominance of primarily Islamic cultures by the West, and also a resurgent religious fervor. The spirit of violence, forced conversion, conquest, and execution has its origins at the very beginning, the early 600s AD or 1500 years ago. Muhammad was a self-proclaimed prophet and also an Arabian warlord. After drafting his vision contained in the Quran, he raised up an army and began to conquer the Arabian Peninsula. After his death, his successors spread widely in all directions, warring and forcing conversions at sword point. Within a century, most of the Middle East and North Africa had been captured. Muslim armies crossed into Spain to the west and penetrated the Indian subcontinent to the east. There are many places in the Quran that urge forced conversions or death to infidels who will not submit to the Islamic path, consistent with Muhammad's own life and actions. It's necessary that we understand the true and profound differences between the three great monotheistic religions of the world. In spite of the simplistic message popularized in the secular West in recent decades, which claims that all religions are essentially the same, no serious student can fail to notice the irreconcilable differences, not only in theological beliefs about God, mankind, and ethics, but also in spirit and temperament. Islam is a coercion religion. Obedience and submission are demanded without option or choice. Christianity is a conversion religion. Every person is invited, but no one can be coerced because true belief is an individual decision. Judaism is a community religion. Those born into or opting to join by choice are included in the community, but most are excluded. The Jews make a serious distinction between themselves and Gentiles, which means all non-Jews. Now let me take a moment to refute a common misunderstanding. Secularists and Muslim apologists have sought to claim a moral equivalency between the terrorism of Islamists in modern times and the series of crusades by Western-majority Christian nations against the Muslim-occupied Middle East of 1,000 years ago. It's caused some to falsely claim that all religions are violent at their core. The Crusades had a number of interwoven causes, political, economic, and cultural, with a religious veneer endorsed by the powerful Roman Catholic Church. The essential difference, however, is this. When Muslims use violence for the sake of their religion's expansion or retribution, they are being completely consistent with the core message and example of their founder. When Christians, on the other hand, use violence for their expansion or retribution, they are going completely contrary to and inconsistent with the core message and example of their founder. Now let's turn our attention back to the current area of heightened conflict. Stephen, beyond the current Gaza war, what do you see as the long-term prospects for peace or for continuing conflict in the Middle East?
Once again, you ask very large questions, but a very good one, a very important one. It seems as though that more nations are beginning to see the wisdom of living in peace and cooperating with Israel for their mutual advantage. Jordan is a good example. Once, they were one of Israel's worst enemies, but they are now, in so many ways, these two nations are cooperating. For example, Jordan now can use the port of Haifa for their imports and their exports, and they're sharing technology regarding agriculture and water use. So we mentioned in the last session Iran, the role of Iran. They're the most significant culprit of mischief in the Middle East. And their biggest rival is Saudi Arabia. The balance of power would certainly shift if Saudi Arabia completed a peace agreement with Israel. And so it is quite a coincidence, or perhaps not, that the infamous October 7th attack occurred as the Saudis were in conversation with the Israelis. So was that dynamic in play? Well, perhaps future historians will clarify that for us. But as for the current conflict, which everyone hates, well, let's face it, there's a humanitarian crisis going on. We don't like violence. This is a terrible thing. But the simple fact of the matter is, Doug, as I see it, Hamas cannot remain standing when this is all over. Now, why do I say that? It's because if they are, every terrorist organization in the world will be encouraged. They will think that if they just weather the storm, no matter how difficult it is, they will survive to continue their evil mayhem. I believe that the conflict in Gaza right now is so much more than just about Gaza. I mean, it is about Gaza. But the question is, will the free world resign itself to living side by side with terrorism? Or do we have the courage to deal with it once and for all? The Israelis see this 75-year ongoing conflict as an existential threat. And I encourage us to be willing to support them, as difficult as it seems. But then standing up to Hitler, if you remember, was also very difficult. And I encourage this. Think about the close of World War II. There were so many, unfortunately, German civilian casualties. But what would the world have been like if the Allies had stopped and allowed Hitler to remain in power? But instead, they went in and finished the job. And look at Germany today. It is a free, prosperous nation run by Germans without the Nazis. What I hope that people will get the vision and to see that when this conflict is over in Gaza, Hamas surrenders and the hostages are released, the conflict will stop. And then we begin the hard work of rebuilding Gaza so it will be able to be a prosperous a place run by Gazans without Hamas. And that's the vision that I hope. If people say, oh, that's impossible. It may have seemed that way in 1945, but look at Germany today. And that's what we have to look for. The free world has to decide, are we going to live side by side with terrorism? Or are we going to take the steps to finally deal with it? But I think one hope, at least until Jesus returns, that ultimately will be the answer to everything, right? When he finally comes and brings his kingdom on earth. But there is a phrase that is cherished by Americans: we the people. And I really believe that the best solutions will not be found by the politicians or even the military leaders, but by the people themselves. Because what I have observed when I have been there and talked to people even here in the United States, the increased relationship and understanding between the respective peoples, if given the opportunity, that is where major steps can happen and actually have been happening. That there have been efforts happening in business, in education, in science, in the arts, but especially with the youth. When Palestinian children and Israeli children, children from Lebanon and Syria, whatever, that they have a chance to get to know each other and be together, and they begin to develop relationships. There is that will be major in the future of the Middle East. And there are so many people who have dedicated their lives to do just that. And there are organizations, there are leaders that are working toward that sense of understanding and cooperation. And the more that happens, the more you see the other as the enemy. But in the end, I really think that Prime Minister Golda Meir got it right. She once said that there will never be peace in the Middle East until the Palestinians choose to love their own children more than they hate the Israelis.
What are the relationships like between Israel and evangelical Christians in the West? It seems as if evangelicals are pretty adamantly supportive of Israel.
Yes, we seem to be, yes. And I have observed that many evangelicals want to support Israel because of their views regarding eschatology, issues pertaining to the end times and supposedly Israel's role in that. Now, I don't personally share many of those views as I read Scripture. However, our Christian faith is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Our Christian faith came out of Judaism because it is the fulfillment of all the promises and all the character types that we see in the Old Testament. It's all pointing toward Christ. So we have a kinship with our Jewish cousins. And so understandably that there would be a desire for a close relationship there. But Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East and has been a steadfast ally of the United States. So Israel is not perfect. It's not always correct, but then neither is the United States, right? But they are our international ally. And they have benefited the world immensely, as we discussed in the last session. In so many ways, we would be foolish not to support our own allies as much as our enemies are supporting theirs.
You know, college campuses in cities in the U.S. have seen in the past 11 months significant protests by people opposed to Israel. I've been trying to discern what the motivations and beliefs among these pro-Hamas demonstrators and rioters are. Here's what I've concluded. Some of the protesters who have caused disruption and violence in the West since October of 2023 have been motivated by a pseudo-Marxist worldview, often called critical theory, that simplistically divides all people into two categories, the oppressed and the oppressors. And they have identified, for whatever reason, all Muslims in Palestine and that area as being oppressed, and therefore the victims. And this view intentionally glosses over the wrongs done against the Jews and refuses sympathy for their victims. Well, that's one group. Then some of the protesters on college campuses and in cities have been undoubtedly professional agitators paid by left-wing progressive groups. We know that. And then some of the protesters are naive and idealistic young people who are following their peers in trendy behavior without understanding the complexity of the Middle East situation. In fact, I heard a revealing on-the-street interview of young protesters at Columbia University in April by a major network reporter who asked them about their chant, you referenced this earlier, "From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free." And the interviewer asked a number of the young people who were protesting, what is the river and what is the sea? And none of them could answer. Finally, Stephen, we have the enduring mystery of the survival of the Jews, as well as the continuing explosions of vicious anti-Semitism directed against them. Can you help us to make sense of that historically?
Yeah, well, first of all, if I might respond briefly to what you just said about the campuses and so forth, I think your analysis is spot on. And I would add to it that with the students being naive and whatever, we're in a culture right now where it is so polarized that it's either got to be all this or all that, and we demonize the other side. Instead of really doing, and you would think on a college campus you would do this would be the best place to do it, is to really to delve into history and to see the whole story and to be able to see the history of Israel and the Middle East. where mistakes have made, where wonderful things have happened, and so forth. But we can't do that. It's got to be all this side or all that side, so from the river to the sea. And they don't realize that what that means is death to Israel. And do they really believe that? So anyway, you raised the question about how is it that for these 2,000 years, where the Jewish people have been dispersed all throughout the world, but somehow they've managed to keep that sense of community, that sense of connection, that sense of identity of who they are. And it's unique, and it's nothing short of miraculous. And I believe that God is not quite finished with the Jewish people yet, that there still is a purpose for that. But there is a common bond that transcends the variety of locations and cultures where they have lived. So as for what seems like a perpetual hate for Jewish people, we must first say that one should never judge by the group. And that happens all the time. This is a result of shallow and lazy thinking, that we just take a whole group of people and judge them all en masse, which is what folks do against the Jews on a regular basis. And but most often, this happens when you have a minority community of people in the midst of a majority group of people. It is very easy, whether out of fears or out of resentments, or just simply because that group of people are different, it's easy to develop stereotypes and assumptions and attitudes about that minority group. And as we discussed in the last session, since 70 AD, the Jewish people have been guests in other people's countries. They've always been this small minority. And they have been told to assimilate. And so when they don't assimilate, then they are prejudiced against because they're different. But then when they have attempted to assimilate, there have been roadblocks in front of them because they're Jews. I mean, it makes no sense. And it's a no-win situation. And this has been going on for almost 2,000 years. So it's also tempting to blame the minority community when times are bad. You got to scapegoat somebody, right? And oftentimes it's been the Jews. But any stereotype that is repeated often enough begins to be believed as fact. I mean, here in America, how many times have I heard that, oh, well, the French don't like Americans? I mean, have you ever heard that? And that they're always rude. Okay, well, my wife and I were in France recently, and we experienced nothing of the kind. They couldn't have been more lovely to us. But nevertheless, people perpetuate these kinds of stereotypes about whole groups of people. So what can compound the problem, though, is that if the minority group does not readily flourish in a host community, then the stereotypes pile up. But in the case of the Jews, even if that minority community is wildly successful, as the Jewish people have done in most areas where they've been, in professions and in business and education, the arts and medicine and all these things, then there's jealousies and resentments and even conspiracy theories abound. I mean, it's a no-win situation for our Jewish friends. I mean, even today, you still hear people saying that the Jewish people are there's a conspiracy to take over the world. You know, it's just ridiculous. But these things are out there. But Doug, I got to tell you, I am so very pleased to be able to say that there's a beautiful monument near Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And it was a gift to the people of the United States from a few Jewish organizations, including the B'nai B'rith. And that monument was there because even though here in America we still have had our problems, it's an expression of gratitude that the Jewish people have been able to find a home here and to flourish. Because even when we don't always do it as well as we should, in America, religious freedom has been a unique part of the American soul. And that has extended to our Jewish friends. But we have to make sure that we remain diligent in doing so.
Thank you, Stephen, for your thoughts and your insights. We hope this has been informative and thought-provoking for you. This is Pastor Doug Pratt and Pastor Stephen Grant coming to you for the Life Academy.
As you no doubt noticed, we covered many questions. But in fact, we only scratched the surface of this fascinating yet complicated subject. But if you would like to explore more deeply the topics we discussed and learn about many other important issues, I recommend this book, War Against the Jews: How to End Hamas Barbarism, by Alan Dershowitz. It's not a particularly long read, but it is very comprehensive in scope. Now, I have to say that this book was produced very quickly, so there are a few typos in the first edition, and there are some things that are repeated, but none of that distracts from its message. It even includes the text of the Hamas charter, so you can read for yourself who they claim to be. This book is available online or at your favorite bookstore, but if you happen to be in Southwest Florida, our bookstore manager, Ann Schick, will have a few copies of this book in the First Presbyterian Church bookstore. This is an excellent book to get if you would like to study the subject of our series in more depth. War Against the Jews by Alan Dershowitz. I highly recommend it. Thank you for listening.